Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This one is going to be significantly different than the previous. Instead of focusing on specific aspects of warfare or vehicles, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the organization and flow of special operations in Halo. And why am I choosing that topic? Well, for starters, Master Chief, John 117, the Spartan we all know and have played, I would consider, well, he is a special operations operator. Spartan 2s fall under the Special Operations Forces, the UNSC. And so looking at how they execute, comparing that to what we have in the modern day, reveals some interesting things. Okay, let's get started. So what does special operations in the real world look like? Keep in mind, what I'm going to tell you is my own opinions, and they're from the perspective of the US. I don't claim to be an expert, so if I make mistakes, don't hold it too much against me. But starting from the top, the US has what we call Unified Combatant Commands. So you have the President, the Secretary of Defense, and these combatant commands are going to be things like AFRICOM, so like Africa Commander, CENTCOM for the Middle East, INDOPACOM for the Pacific, EUCOM, and so on. But outside of just those region-specific commands, you have a unified functional command called SOCOM, Special Operations Command. And the whole reason that came about was failures the U.S. experienced painfully in the past. So there was something called Operation Eagle Claw in the early 80s to rescue hostages kept by Iran. And the idea was we're going to have different special operations assets supported by conventional functions to go in there into the middle of the desert and to get helicopters, pick them up, bring them out. A lot of moving parts to the point where there was a breakdown in coordination, having all these independent pieces try to come together at one moment for a mission, and it led to disaster. Several Americans died, and it was a huge embarrassment to the US. I mean, Iran captured several destroyed pieces of equipment, and it was all televised, and was an incredibly rough look, and was kind of a black eye on the nation there for a while. So Congress was like, enough is enough, and they passed something called the Goldwater-Nichols Act that created SOCOM. And so what SOCOM does is, being a functional command, it is a command up there comparable to all the other major theater commands, that its task is to take subordinate components from the different branches. And when I say branches, I'm talking Air Force, Navy, Army, obviously, and now space. And you roll all those components together under one command. So instead of having the different branches competing or different theaters competing, you just have one unified command for all special operations forces in the US. So the SOCOM in the US is composed of USASOC for the Army, MARSOC, Marines, NAVSOC or NAVSPEC, WARCOM, the Naval Special Warfare Command, and NAVSOC, which is Air Force. And as you can see, like I said, you have each of the branches with the representation under one single command. And why that's good is every branch tends to compete for both missions, relevancy, and funding. And so you don't want to have like strategic assets like, say, bombers competing against ground dudes against the Navy. That's how it happens, but that can kind of create a breakdown. Like everyone's trying to like elbow out the other in order to have relevancy. And so creating SOCOM means it's like, hey, you have all this money just for your mission set, just for special operations. It makes everything easier when it comes to simplifying funding and command and control, like you're already pre-organized for a mission set from the different branches. Okay, so that's how we do it in the real world, but how does it show up in Halo? Well, it's interesting because Halo took a lot of inspiration from the real world. So right off the bat, the one major special operations component we see in the games and in the books is NAVSPEC, WARCOM, really mouthy, NAVSOC. That is actually where Spartans fall under in the Halo universe. NAVSOC obviously is what we have in the real world, so it's kind of clear Bungie probably just did a quick Google search and used that for inspiration. But outside of NAVSOC, we don't really hear too much about other special operations group. Instead, NAVSOC is actually responsible for stuff like ODSTs, Spartan 2s, and to an extent Spartan 3s. Some of that will change later in the timeline, which we'll touch on here in a second. The UNSC in itself is actually very weird because instead of having multiple like theater commands or having branches, you just have Naval Command and Ground Command, which not the greatest idea. And they form joint task force to support what they call like Central Command theaters, or just like regions in space of different planets, which in itself makes sense. I.e., when Reach was under attack, very short attack before it was destroyed, they had a region command for that area with one single commander. And while that's all important, it's like kind of creepy and it gets into like a whole bunch of very staff officer bullshit that no one likes to hear, is having commands and stuff like that can create problems, but it also solves a lot of problems. What I'm getting at is in all this, when I talk about it, it's like if you have a theater command, they understand the needs in their region better than anyone else. Instead of having one dude, it's like, hey, you're responsible for all of space. Okay, you can have that guy, but then you have tasked out subordinate commands that are like, I'm responsible for the defensive reach. They know what they need and stuff like that for requisitioning supplies, allocating personnel, and so on. So that's how it works in the UNSC. And like I said, it kind of changes a little bit with the Spartans. In 2553, independent Spartan branch was made, which is a terrible idea, which I'll touch on in a second. And so Spartan 4s, some Spartan 3s, and some Spartan 2s actually fall under Spartan branch, while the remaining Spartan 2s still fall under the UNSC NAVSOC. And then ground command, aka Unicom, controls Noble Team. And that's mainly because Halo Reach focused a lot of like the ground warfare, like it was much more militarily relevant in terms of like with their inspiration. And so Unicom is much more like your actual ground command commanders. And that was like soldiers, some non-ODST Marines, and then Noble Team. And so that's kind of how special operations works in Halo. It's very vague and very thin. You have one group, NAVSOC, that seems to do everything, including ODSTs and Spartans. You have a little bit under Unicom, which NAVSOC is subordinate to UNSC Naval Command, FleetCom, I believe. And then Unicom, Unified Ground Command, has some extension to Noble Team. And that's really all we have touched on. So let's hit the differences then between the two. The biggest one is the UNSC doesn't have a Unified Special Operations Command, and that will absolutely hurt their ability to conduct special operations. And some of that, is due to the lessons that we learned in the real world. Like I've already talked a little bit at length about why the US decided to have a separate unified command, and those lessons still apply to the UNSC. Like that could help them conduct operations. Beyond that, a separate Spartan-specific branch is a terrible idea. And why is this such a bad idea? You don't want to take one very niche mission set, Spartans, and put them in a separate branch, because now, let's say you're the Navy or Unicom and you need Spartan support, you're having to go all the way up to your branch commander, and then over to Spartans and then down to get it tasked out. It doesn't always have to work like that. A lot of the stuff can be pre-coordinated, like maybe the Spartan branch does allocate, a unit or two of Spartan 4s to assist the Unicom on a ground mission, or maybe there's a joint task force, in which case you have Unicom, like Army guys, you have UNSC Naval Command with the ships and the Marines, and then and ODSTs actually under NAVSOC, and then you have Spartan branch attaching Spartans. But because they're so separated, it just creates so many issues. You have problems with funding, like really nerdy stuff that most people don't think about when it comes to warfare, but that is 100% realistic and very important. Let's say you have Spartans attached to your brigade and you're the Army guys in charge of said brigade. Now it's like, okay, am I funding the munitions and the weapons and the vehicles for the Spartans? Are they bringing their own? Like who are they subordinate to? Are they subordinate to me as the brigade commander, or are they going to be subordinate to like the Spartan branch? Do they have their own command? And that's what I was getting at earlier. Like when you have the different branches, you can have a lot of issues working together and communicating, which is why having one single special operations command like we have in the real world would simplify things. Because instead of having Spartans competing against different branches, you could still have your own separate Spartan branch. But instead, they can focus on like training, acquisitions, and researching like new opportunities and stuff like that. But then you can have Spartans tasked out to SOCOM, just like the real world, with the Naval, Air Force, and Army assets to correspond. Then that way, the UNSC has like a pre-built package. Instead of having to attach things, which is very inflexible, like if shit's moving really quickly on the ground and you're trying to like scrounge together stuff, it's like, hey, no, instead, we're going to have a set SOCOM in the UNSC that's going to have its own special operations task force that will be then tasked out for stuff. It means that SOCOM and the UNSC will be able to run its own ops. It'll be funded independently. It's not competing. Spartans aren't having to compete against other assets. Instead, it's their entire mission sets being funded and has representation for stuff like funding and supply. and then each subordinate component can train and integrate together. You would have Spartans working together with both the Navy, space assets, and air assets. That type of training makes everyone execute better. So my kind of like overall closing thoughts on the organization here is Halos are very basic and immature in terms of organization. And that in itself is not surprising. Bungie obviously are not military leaders, and I don't expect anything different. They probably just kind of looked at Google and took inspiration from the real world. But the point of these videos is to kind of have a little bit of fun, taking a deep dive and seeing the differences between the two. And the major one there is lacking a unified command. The UNSC is going to have issues pulling soft assets, special operations forces assets, from each of the different branches and commands. They're going to have competing demands for funding and time and allocations and stuff like that. And it creates to a lack of coordination, which is why kind of simplifying things helps. But this was part one, focusing on the organization. If this is something you enjoyed, you can look forward to part 2 and 3 respectively, which will explore both the mission sets, the actual application of Spartans and how it compares to the special operations forces we have in the US. And then part 3 will focus on the training and why it's really cruel and how they're messed up. Special shout out to my 7 subscribers, KL32. You guys are the best. Keep up the support, hit me with the comments, and let me know what you think. See you guys later.